Howdy, hello. Already profanity and inappropriate content for young audiences, but welcome to the fight site. Another prediction panel. This one is for UFC 259, I believe the card is titled. Off to a good start. And we're going to be focusing on two fights here. We're going to be breaking down Aljamain Sterling versus Petr Yan. I'm going to say Peter. I don't care if you want to correct me. And also Israel Adesanya versus Jan Blachowicz. And the format of these is pretty unique. Basically, every panelist is going to get a chance to break down both fighters and the matchup, taking turns to talk so we can all get our analysis in so you can hear a few different perspectives. And we might get some addressing of other points. It ends up being a little different than we start out with the format, but keeps us all in check and helps it stay organized. But yeah, I have with me my colleagues from the fight site and Dan Tom, who's like an honorary member of the fight site, but we can't afford him. But he writes for MMAJunkie and does a lot of other stuff involving gambling and betting. So if you're a degenerate like that, highly recommend following Dan Tom for that alone, regardless of the rest of the great stuff he does. And I'm not going to let them go around and introduce themselves because I don't trust them. They're just reckless, wild people. But yeah, so we're going to go one fight at a time. We're going to start with the bantamweight title fight between Petr Yan and Aljamain Sterling. Both guys are on great win streaks. This is probably one of the best fights the UFC could possibly make. And these are two fighters that I think a lot of us have studied in decent depth. So I think we're going to have a lot to say here. And I think I'll go last. So I don't feel like talking anymore. So the order is going to be Ben, Dan, Sriram, and then myself. The format is we're all going to go around and talk about Petr Yan as a fighter, just giving our evaluation of his strengths and weaknesses and not discussing the matchup. Ben, he screwed this up before, speaking directly to him right now. So round one, we're all going to talk about Petr Yan. Then it's going to be like snake draft format. Whoever went last is going to start with Sterling. We're going to go back around and talk about Sterling. And then same deal. And then we're going to talk about the matchup and do our predictions as the third. So 3 rounds of speaking for each fight. And we're going to start with Jan Sterling. So Ben, you're going to kick us off, giving us your breakdown of Petr Yan, whatever you want to say about him to start off. Hey, so Ben was trying to record with wireless earbuds and the connection was messing up. So his whole piece about Petr Yan, basically unusable. The audio was just too messed up. So we're cutting this part, but it wasn't that good anyway. And Ben sucks. So moving on to the next person. And don't worry, Ben will have his chance to get some good analysis in. Thank you.
All right. I like the words build you used for his overall pace. I'm not going to get too much into this striking as far as Yan. Obviously, he does switch stances. And the only note I'll really say on that, speaking in themes, is that Jan's a fighter that's not going to be surprised often. We saw, I think you mentioned Jimmy Rivera as far as past opponent, and we saw him, this past weekend. Get his leg, kind of his calf kicked, and he was very surprised by it. And that's something you never want to see, especially from fighters at the higher levels, to be surprised by anything. And I think that's one of Jan's best attributes is very little surprises him, even when it's Jose freaking Aldo fighting, kind of dusting off some old school tactics and whatnot. He still, even when he wasn't doing as well as some of us thought, and I'm definitely going to be looking into that kick defense that Ben noted on when you look at the matchup. We'll talk further at hand. But yeah, I like that he can A, not be surprised, and B, have those options to switch stances to where, okay, you're targeting this. Let's see if you can target it as easily with this look. And he's very calm about himself. As far as the clinch goes, what I really like and how I kind of write his grappling up is that he turns defense into offense. So when he is successfully defending from the clinch, he will turn his defense into offense, or if he's on the ground, he's on his back, he will turn offense into defense as far as attacking from the guard, using that to sweep, attacking legs to create scrambles to get on top. And he's got a very good, he'll play in the fire, but he's really good about playing in the fire. And I'm sure that'll come up as far as those ranges go, how it pertains to this matchup. But what I will say is I really just like how, whether he's doing the old school Fedor techniques of using a trip to create a scramble and then having offense off of that. So he's countering grappling with more grappling to open up more offense, again, turning defense into offense again, or on the ground. He does do things really well. Even though he will, all scramblers kind of inherently have to tripod and turtle. So no matter what feelings are on that move, it's something and a position you just have to navigate if you're a scrambler, especially in the lower divisions. I really like how Jan kind of swims his arms. He has a good sense of where the position is. Just seems really well trained. I'm really curious to see, and I'm definitely going to touch more on this when we come back around for predictions, but I'm curious to see what is behind and what can be expected from his move to American Top Team, where he did this camp. He looks like he's been there all of 2021, and how that affects his game going into the matchup. Obviously, it's there's a lot of Brazilians and Russians that cross train over there. As far as tactics or techniques, obviously the calf kick gets synonymous with them. It's definitely not a place. It's definitely a place where you're at the very least going to get some better wrestling via osmosis. Even guys who aren't known for their wrestling tend to have, or that are underrated wrestlers, have come or trained from that camp. So we'll see there. It's not like it's a glaring weakness. Stylistically, it may match up, which we'll talk about later. But that is my big X factor looking into this. Again, I'm full disclosure. I'm not going to have the hardest of take because I'm still balls deep, if you will, in these matchups as far as doing my own studies. But yeah, I'm real curious of what that intangible looks like with American Top Team.
Yeah, I mean, Ben and Dan covered most of the stuff that I would say. Petr Yan is a fundamentally brilliant pressure fighter. He's very good at drawing the reactions out of his opponents in terms of ring craft. So that's one thing that we saw in the Jimmy Rivera fight, where Rivera was making his exits off that right hand and he cut him off with the left hook. That's kind of Yan's process in a nutshell. He's very good at range in terms of, obviously wants to be in the pocket, but he's very good at converting his defense. He's the collar ties and the long guard that he does to grab the collar tie flows very well in terms of continuing his offense and entering the range that he wants to be in. He works off the jab pretty well. He has a really nasty straight to the body. That's one quirk about him, where he just really sits down on it, and it's very mean. It's one of the best things about him, just from an aesthetic perspective and what I like seeing. What else? In the clinch, I think his incredibly diligent wrist control is probably what makes the difference. It's something that we'll touch on when we get to Aljo, but it's really hard for Yan opponents to gain any sort of foothold because he's so diligent about grabbing the wrist and hitting off it, or just even he can use it to suss out his opponent's reactions. One of my favorite sequences from the Faber fight was when he had the wrist and I believe an underhook, and Faber was trying to hit on the break, and Yan counterpunched him from in there just because he had such a great beat on what Faber was doing off that wrist control. So Yan is absolutely brilliant in the clinch. On the ground, we haven't seen a ton of him from the bottom. We saw a little bit against Jinsu San, but it's worth noting that Yan's still pretty early in his career. There's still some improvements that he could make pretty much everywhere. But, Jinsu San is also big and immortal, so it's really tough to blame him for that. There, he kind of played guard and didn't really scramble as actively, but against Rivera, he was very active. He pulled a leg lock and then scrambled back up off that. There was at the end, I believe Ed's probably going to elaborate on a little bit more. He hit a limp arm from, I believe, a single leg and got to the back, which was really slick. He's making improvements, and he has some nice moves. On top, he destroyed Jose Aldo and Douglas Silva de Andrade, which is pretty impressive, although Aldo was pretty much done by then. It's actually tough to come up with things that are like, this is really dazzling about Petr Yan, which is why I think people have really honed in on his competition being somewhat weak for a bantamweight champion. Jose Aldo's a fantastic win, but also at bantamweight, it's kind of a strategic, easy fight for someone who throws a lot of volume and is super durable over 5 rounds. Tactically, it was really difficult, and I think that's where we saw Petr Yan's mind at work. For instance, when Aldo was going to the left hook to the body, he was catching pitching with the left hook to the head. He was drowning him in the clinch, and the pressure took away the kicks. But there's a lot less flash to his game. It's a very Russian game, if that makes sense. And I think that's kind of tricking people. And we're going to see against Aljo whether it holds up against someone who's a lot more janky. Ed, what's your rate?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very high on Jan since before his UFC debut. A lot of people were because largely because of what he did in ACB. Uh, Mostly his first title fight with Magomedov for the title. That was his like sixth pro fight, something like that. It was like 2 or 3 years into his career. Magomedov, control based grappler, very wrestling heavy approach, and Jan was more or less a pure striker at that point who knew things about wrestling grappling, and they just had an absolute war. And Jan made some mistakes defensively as a grappler, and he wasn't fully fleshed out, but he was like giving him hell off his back, and knew how to change the momentum, pressure him in a way that made it harder for Magomedov to wrestle, and just made it the toughest fight as humanly possible. And I believe there was a point deduction that changed the way the fight would have been scored, and he actually had an argument for winning it, which was insanely impressive at the time. And then like 2 fights later, they have a rematch, and Jan just absolutely puts on like the perfect performance for that opponent. Worth mentioning that Magomedov in that fight looked totally different as well, like completely transformed himself on the feet. And interestingly enough, and I didn't notice this the first time, and I think I didn't notice it because the Aldo fight hadn't happened yet, but when I recently went back and watched Magomedov 2, uh, it was a very similar performance from Magomedov to what Aldo was doing with the open stance body kicking, and the way he was trying to counter Jan and deal with his pressure. And makes me think that Aldo, either it was just a common read because of the way they analyzed his style, or maybe he watched the fight and was like, I can do that, and came out much more kick heavy than normal. But as Ben said early on, a few opponents picked up on that. Like, this guy is coming in heavy, and he has to put a lot of weight in his lead leg because of the way he is so intentional with his pressure that makes him more kickable. And just built in things about his game that make it harder to kick. But yeah, I noticed him early on, because of that fight being amazing, obviously. But then once you start to watch his catalog, through ACB, you realize that he's a very consistent fighter. His game is pretty well defined. It's pressure. He's one of the most committed pressure fighters in the sport, and he has the tools to make that work. He has the attributes to make that work, and he's been fleshing out the rest of his skills ever since then. And I think that's what makes him pretty special, is that he's definitely a standout when it comes to his pressure fighting tactics and the way he boxes, and the way he can mix up level changes and feints, and striking round to cut off exits, and plus his kicking game, which people don't talk about very often either. But the 2 things that really stand out to me are, one, that he's a 5-round fighter. He's someone that builds over time and gains momentum and has the cardio to weaponize that and make that work. Picking up the rhythm of his attack and increasing volume as a product of rhythm, more so than fighters who try to maintain a similar pace and break you over time. Jan eases into the fight, waits to make his reads, and starts to build up that pressure and freak people out over time. Like, if you even watch the Rivera fight, you can see it happening in small instances. It's not like a slow roll over time. Like, he has these moments where the pressure starts to build and the rhythm starts to pick up and the pressure gets heavier and the feints build up, and that's when Rivera starts to make those mistakes and opens himself up. That's something really special that he can do. A little bit, I'm not just saying because he's Russian. A little bit reminds me of Khabib with the psychological aspect of the pressure. How just like the intimidation factor of him picking up the pressure can really affect people. I think that's something you can't write off. When we get to the matchup portion, I might mention that a little bit as well. But yeah, so that whole the pace factor definitely is one of my favorite things about him. He's really built to thrive over championship rounds. And the other thing is his transitional work. And the reason I really love him as a pressure fighter is because he's one of the best clinch fighters in MMA. It's not something that's going to stand out to everyone, I don't think, because he's not like getting long periods of control in the clinch like Usman. He's not like deading people consistently from the clinch, although he like had the clinch break offense against Faber, which really stood out to people and started to make them realize it a little bit more. It's mostly just the transitional work. He's just very solid in clinch positions. He really understands the leverage and the footwork of those positions, and he uses it to continue to pressure. So a lot of the time, guys can be put off pressure when they're fighting a grappler or someone they don't want to be engaged with in certain ranges, because if I'm pushing forward and they come back hard at me, I either need to concede space or get off at an angle, or we're going to collide, and I don't want to be there. He's fine with that. He's really good at getting his frames up, posting off in the bicep or turning them off or pulling and turning them off. And just using those clinch tools really well to redirect people or, get that little bit of space back and strike them off to back them up again and continue his pressure. That's something you saw a lot more in the Magomedov rematch and the points in the first fight when he started to figure out how to pressure without being grappled as much. And the grappling is very interesting to me, the wrestling and the grappling. Like you said, his top game has developed a lot. His bottom game was pretty active and dangerous, even that first Magomedov fight. But that's like the weirdest thing about him is that, like Ben said, there's the Jinsu Sun fight where he got taken down. There's like the Dodson fight where he got taken down. There's been fights where he's like thrown himself out of position and ended up grappling with people in weird positions and weird ways. And we're like, why is this happening? But I still, you got it, Dan. You still have to think about the time when he fought basically the only dedicated grappler of his entire career and came in with such a good game plan and knew exactly how to deal with him. And it just so happens there are actually a lot of similarities between that guy and Aljamain Sterling. So it's going to be a pretty nice analog, despite it being, 5 years ago, something like that, 4 years ago. But yeah, I really love Yan. I think he has a lot of potential to go really far in MMA as long as the attributes hold up. I don't think he's like a freak athlete or anything. I just think the durability and the pace are very, very important for his game. So yeah, there's a lot I like about him. There's a lot I like about Aljamain Sterling too. And just to give Dan Tom a little bit of time, I'm just going to roll into my Aljamain Sterling piece, and then Ben, you can go next. I did write an article about Aljamain Sterling. I focused on the way he gets to his takedowns, the way he gets to his shots, his entries. He's huge for 135, and he does a really good job finishing his shots against the cage. But earlier in his career, I saw him stall out a bunch of times, hitting these full level changes to the knee on single legs in open space and trying to finish that way. And that's something that always troubles me because most of the time when I see that, it's because guys took shots from too far away or didn't set them up well. So I wanted to take a look at how is he setting up these shots? And the truth is he was actually setting them up very well. He had a really nice feel for wrestling early in his career, both reactively and on the lead. But the problem was on the lead, a lot of the time it was him moving people back and then shooting off that motion of his combinations. And when you have someone kind of retreating from you and you shoot to their leg, a lot of the time you're catching lower on the ankle and you have to extend yourself like that and hit the ground. Like if you look at Habib versus Ali Quinta, that's a good example of just inopportune, not ideal shot opportunities, making it harder to get to your finishes. And you saw Sterling not able to finish on Takeo Mizugaki and people who were much worse wrestlers than him. But then when he had these really nice clean entries where he's intercepting pressure and he's punching into the clinch or an underhook or kicking into level changes, things like that, when he has people planted and swinging on him, that's when he's been able to do really well. And that's something that persisted throughout his career, but his style really shifted in a couple of key fights as a wrestler. Obviously his grappling is great. I'm not going to knock his grappling at all, but as a top player, it's very important, how your wrestling functions, how you're going to get to those positions. So the first couple times we saw him really do this well were the Renan Barão and Cody Stamann fights, and it was because of his pressure. It was because of his ring craft. He was able to pressure his opponents to the cage, and a lot of it was just volume and feint based, and his opponents didn't have amazing ring craft, but it was intentional and he was doing it. And like we said, a lot of ring craft in MMA is about in position. It's just trying and doing it and not being scared off and having something to threaten with to get people to back off. Being active with his lead hand, round kicking to cut off exits, front kicking to back them up. A lot of feinting, a lot of level changing, a lot of clinching and breaking from the clinching, coming up and down and in and out of the clinch. It's what people think that Colby Covington does really well. But he was actually doing it well against decent defensive wrestlers and doing something with the positions and wrestling well. But yeah, you saw that in the Barão fight, and Barão, I think, had never been taken down. I don't know, in his career or just MMA or just the UFC at all. But he was like the first one to really take down Barao and out grapple him, and he did it on the cage, and in all those transitions. The Cody Stamen fight was a little weird because one of the times it was like they kicked at the same time and Stamen fell. But for the most part, it was because he was, pressuring him to the fence with his jab and, mixing up levels and feinting and drawing out reactions so he could get a clean shot at the legs. And when you have long arms like that, doubles on the cage are a lot easier. And finally, we saw in the Corey Sandhagen fight, immediately pressured to the cage, got him kicking, shot a single up into an underhook, and then did a nice job of like pulling the wrist across while punching the underhook, which was supposed to put his back on the mat, but then Corey Sandhagen bailed on it and gave up his back, and that wasn't good either. And that's not the first person we've seen give up their back to try to scramble with Aljamain Sterling. Brett Johns did it as well. Ben says Stamen didn't fall. I just watched the clip before we started. Yeah, so those are things I noticed about Sterling's wrestling, when it's more effective, when it's less effective. The least effective it is reactively. Didn't turn into a particularly good reactive shooter, and I think it's a lot about being tall for the weight class. Makes it really hard to get a deep level change. Like I talked about, the difference between him shooting all the way to the knee and him shooting higher on the legs and closer to the hips. He doesn't have particularly good footwork on his doubles reactively, so I think that's part of why he can't run it to finish when it's reactive, and he doesn't have the positioning to set himself up for it. So you saw against Pedro Munoz, who it wasn't that important for him to take down Munoz, but I think he was mostly shooting just to relieve the pressure. But again, he was shooting into Munoz's hips and had a hard time moving him around or getting anything off that. And Jim Rivera, he had some issues wrestling him as well, but he did get all that cage control. And again, these are two people that he beat, so it's not that big of a deal. But just, when you're looking at where his strengths are as a wrestler, definitely when he's able to pressure people and get to the cage, or when he's able to get them to plant and set them up and get them to swing and time their counters. Next time I speak, I'll decide how that matches up with Peter Yan. But Ben is ready to jump down my throat about something. You can go ahead and talk about Aljamain Sterling, Ben.
No, that's my bad. I was actually thinking of the Corey Sandhagen fight, because that's actually how he got the takedown. He entered the clinch exchange. Was he caught a kick and they kicked at the same time? Corey kicked at his body and he kicked at Corey's leg. That was the key.
Stamen definitely fell over.
You're right. Although he did get a nice takedown on entries on Cody anyway. So yeah, it's Aljamain Sterling. So as someone who practices the fake martial art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I tend to gravitate towards grapplers. I like that, to pretend that our martial art works. So when I see it being employed, it's a really good feeling. Much like that fake martial art of kickboxing, where Jan Blachowicz is going to show us why kickboxing is not real. God, please let it happen. It'll be really goddamn funny. But Aljamain Sterling, so the progression we've seen throughout his career is, and I think this is something that happens a lot with fighters in general who start their UFC careers really, really, really early. And I think we saw it a little bit with Corey Sandhagen, and we're going to see it again we saw it with Aljamain Sterling too. Aljo came in really early in his career, and now he's actually been a veteran in the UFC for 6 years. Not 6 years as a pro, 6 years in the UFC. He has had 14 fights, I believe. He's fought in one of the toughest divisions or deepest divisions in sport. Arguably, it's the most skillful division at the top. I would personally argue that is the best top 5 in the sport. So we're talking about a weight class that is not forgiving to you. If you get knocked out, it's not forgiving. If you get submitted, you drop down really fast. You get your stock drops. You're going to be fighting people who are really, really good in the middle of the rankings, and you're just not gonna move up or down if you're losing those fights. So we did see a real progression of stages of Aljamain's career, how he handled those different bits of adversity, the improvements he's made on the feet and on the ground and in his wrestling and his clinch. So I think the Aljamain Sterling we have now can be summed up as somebody who's absolutely 100% a defined outfighter. He doesn't want to fight in the pocket, and if he can avoid it, he is somebody who wants to be all the way out or all the way in at all times. When he's on the outside, he really utilizes his significant size advantage that he has over virtually every single fighter in that division. He is a massive bantamweight. I have no idea how he makes that weight. He's already on the wrong side of 30, so I don't know how much longer he can keep making it. I know even earlier in his career, he was talking about moving up to 45. And from insider information, I know how much he's cutting. He is somebody that loves to throw tons of volume, both with his punches and particularly with his kicks. He has a really, really nice variety of kicks that he throws. He throws both round kicks and straight kicks up the middle, and he uses them extremely well to back his opponents up when he wants to be able to pressure them or keep them off of him when he's being pressured backwards. We saw them utilized to great effect against Pedro Munoz. He ate a fair share of kicks himself. However, he doesn't mind being able to kick, because if you try to, he doesn't really, he's one of those grapplers who knows that you're not going to want to grab his leg, because if you try and take him down, that means he gets to engage in a grappling exchange with you. You don't want to scramble with him, and we'll get to that in a moment. So his main issues on the feet, he is kind of janky. There's no question. It's not the smoothest head movement. It's not the smoothest punching mechanics. It's not the smoothest kicking mechanics. I would say his kicking mechanics are a lot better than his punching mechanics, but it works. It's really, really well put together for what it is. His head movement and his defensive reactions fit very well into him constantly searching for those clinch and takedown entries. And if his opponents are too close and they're trying to swing wildly at him, he's going to be able to get those intercepting clinch entries. Against Pedro Munoz, we saw him use that more as just a way of kind of stopping the exchange from happening when Pedro was trying to overwhelm him. And he did do that really, really well. I think people are going to point out to this when they're talking about the actual matchup themselves. So I think it's important to note, against Pedro Munoz, I don't think he really was interested in going to the ground with Munoz. In fact, the one time that Pedro really tried to aggressively get him to the ground, Aljamain really didn't want a part of it. Not because I don't think he was confident, but I think he felt confident that he could beat him on the feet. So he didn't want to risk, being on the ground with him. He has been out-grappled before, granted much earlier in his career, by Brian Caraway. But it's still probably something he's like, why engage with Pedro on the ground? There's no point. I can't think of anybody who's really beaten Pedro there off the top of my head. Please feel free to correct me right now if I'm wrong. So there. Aljo's clinch entries and his back takes. He has the best back taking game in the sport today. It is the single most dangerous position you want to be in against Aljamain. His length and his strength and his technical abilities in that particular position are ridiculously elite. I would say that he's honestly a more dangerous person to have on your back than someone like Demian Maia due to his athletic advantage. And I mean that because we're talking about it in an MMA context. He's a far more dangerous ground and pounder than Demian Maia, which opens up the opponents he's going to be grappling with. And Demian, just quite frankly, if you go watch the Gunnar Nelson fight, if he had even a modicum of ground and pound ability, Gunnar Nelson would be dead. There would be an obituary. His shorts would have been hung up in the arena. He should be dead. The amount of punches he took cleanly to the head. And in fact, Gunnar Nelson was totally fine and his chin was fine. So I think that in certain ways, I'm going to get flamed for that one. I can't wait. I think that when you're talking about danger, encompass everything. Yes, Demian Maia is better at purely jiu-jitsu, but in terms of MMA grappling, once they're there on the back, Maia might ride you for 3 rounds. Aljo's not going to ride you for 3 rounds. He's going to fuck you up for as long as it takes before he can submit you. So when he's in those back take positions, specifically against the fence, his ability to control you, his positioning both with his legs, his hips, and his grips are perfect in every sense. This Corey Sandhagen sequence in particular was so beautiful because he was controlling the far side wrist, forced and had that deep underhook, forced Corey to try and post in order to be able to escape. Corey had to give up the overhook, which opened him up to get to the back. He threw his leg over to the other side, pinned it against Corey's hip, and was leaning on him. So that opened up Corey's left side just ever so slightly so he could easily slide that first hook in, and then came back around and got that second hook, all while continuing to hold that far side wrist, which was a key part of it because he was using it as an anchor point. So that's how fucking good Aljo is my point. On the ground itself, he's pretty much up there with the elite guys. His passing game is really, really, really high level. He likes to keep a lot of pressure as he passes. And his length actually really helps with that, because when you have a guy who can exert that much pressure and is also going to have that length, it's going to be really hard to reestablish hooks and recover position. He's an excellent scrambler himself, and that's something that's going to be really troubling for Petr Yan, because when you're a guy who gets out of bad spots in MMA with that, I think I'm skipping to the fight. Am I good? So move. Okay. So yeah, Aljo, as a fighter, he's an outfighter. To summarize, he's an outfighter who's seriously volume heavy, and on the ground, he's someone who's going to look to find those spots he won't necessarily need those scrambles because he's an excellent control-oriented grappler. But if you're somebody who's going to be looking to scramble out, he's going to be able to find those positions to take your back basically from anywhere. You could take it off the takedown attempts. You could take it off the clinch. You could take it on the ground itself. He's just that damn good. Also, you might get a full Nelson. So that's something that's you're not really going to see. And I really enjoyed that. Anyway, go ahead.
Nice. I'm not going to talk too much again about the striking, because I feel like I got to refresh myself on that. I had an older take on Aljo, like, it's a suspect of his boxing range, right? Like a lot of these all the way in or all the way out style fighters. And then he shows a little bit better trunk movement and attaching things and making that trunk movement a bit more functional with what he comes back with. And as far as the wrestling goes, I don't disagree with anything on Ed's notes previously. And I don't know how much a wrist would trouble with his entry choice, which was a great point that Ed made. But I do remember, and I wrote this in my notes prior to the Sandhagen fight, that Aljo was talking about a wrist injury that was plaguing him, specifically his wrestling and finishing shots. According to him, that is, that he got finally addressed before that Sandhagen fight. I don't know how much that would imply or go with anything that like Ed or anyone else watching or listening to this has come across in their, proverbial findings. But it is worth taking into note. And I like how Ben broke down that back taking sequence to kind of demonstrate how good he is from there. I remember saying that in defense of Sandhagen, after that Aljamain Sterling fight, is that, don't write him off that easily. Like the setup and the way it went in, how he tied in the choking arm and blended it naturally to the wrist control hand, like all those little things. It was super slick. So I agree, as bold as it is, what Ben said about his back control. I agree. He's one of the best, and regardless of division and his build and his squeeze. A big thing is that he's really saving grace from the takedowns, and perhaps in this fight is that he counters kicks a lot. It was something I noted in the Sandhagen fight because they both counter kicks, obviously in different ways. Sandhagen's not looking to get takedowns from it. But he's looking to, do it from the striking theme. And the striking theme, obviously I think the counter and kicks will apply here, right? However, the striking theme, I will say, where it ties in the parallels here, I think, is the wrist control. Because even though we talked about Jan's wrist control, his is more from a striking from, Dutch hand traps, closing the distance, to clinch striking and clinch controls and clinch tactics, where as Aljamain, starts from clinch, but more clinch grappling, shot defense, and down to the grappling of the floor as far as the benefits of wrist control, right? Hard to take down, pass, or submit someone if you have one hand. I think Aljamain made a post like a couple of years ago. I remember going through his Instagram, as I do before these fights, and he's defending a shot in wrestling practice, and he says a quote. He says, "When in doubt, grab a wrist." And I love it because it's something that I preach to the freaking high heavens for the last decade. And finally, the pro fighters that are actually making their money doing this shit are starting to do it, which is nice to see. Aljamain's definitely one of those. So I think the countering of the kicks, if anything, is the most important note on the feet that I can offer you guys right now at this time, as relevant to this match. And I'll explain why in the next segment. But yeah, I completely agree with what Ben said about the back taking and him being just a real dominant factor there. I know he's been coaching a lot of wrestling in this in-between time, splitting camp time at Extreme Couture. That's, I guess, his intangible. But whether he's at Extreme Couture or back in Long Island, the guy's in the practice room with the pros, helping pros, and teaching wrestling practices, which I always think is a really good thing, for fighters to sharpen up, keep sharp their base in general, and kind of have those reps. Teaching makes you a better practitioner. So real curious to see what this expansion for Aljo looks like.
And he wrestled Roman Bravo Young at a pro event and did pretty well.
Yeah, I heard about that. Bravo Young won pretty wide, right? Or was it super competitive? I heard.
No, Aljo actually threw him on the edge and got 4, and got scored on a few times, but only lost by like 1 or 2 because of it. But there's also a big size advantage, and Aljo gamed it a little bit, but it was still he scored big on a really good college wrestler and someone who's starting to be a really good senior level wrestler. So and everyone was trashing Aljo before the match because he posted a couple training clips that looked bad. And the wrestling community is like, what is this? Like, are you kidding? And then he actually, had a good match for himself. So, he did well there.
Yeah, I remember there was something notable about it. I just don't remember if it went exactly as how it's supposed to, or kind of changed it. Nothing to add on the wrestling. Ed and Ben covered it pretty well. Long story short, he's just really nasty to have on your back. The full Nelson against Cody Stamen was actually really nice. I wish he got it because the Sula stretch was nice, but also kind of ruined by Zabit doing it after. So the full Nelson would have been something more unique, although Zabit might have just stolen it again. On his striking, I think the details of his striking hasn't really been gone into that much depth. We mostly saw it against Pedro Munoz. Because against Jimmy Rivera, there was a lot of outside striking, and we saw how Aljo could really frustrate a fighter with a very defined close range. As Ben mentioned, it was the all the way in, all the way out, where Rivera wants to be in the pocket, and Aljo just kind of frustrated him with his distancing, where he would play this really janky, weird kicking game, and then every time Rivera tried to do anything, he just ran in and clinched him against the fence, which is incredibly frustrating to watch for someone who wanted Rivera to win that fight. But, we don't hold grudges, but we definitely do. I think in the Munoz fight, we saw good and bad. Aljo, it looked like a fight that Aljo would really struggle in over 5 rounds because of the attritional work of Pedro Munoz, which bears decent relevance to a fight against Petr Yan. Aljo, he's not particularly tight as a striker in any phase, but he's pretty crafty. We saw some decent direction changes against a kind of plodding, weird pressure against Pedro Munoz, where Aljo was able to get him stepping one way and move the other, walk him onto the jab. That's how he won the 3rd round, jabbing from both stances and the counter hook. And again, the weird kicking game. Aljo's not very good in the pocket, like in terms of just even pocket exchanges, but he can walk guys into stuff decently with his ring craft. And we actually saw against Sandhagen, he's not, I was about to say not stupid, but I think the better way to put it is smart. He's pretty smart in terms of strategy. Corey Sandhagen does have a tendency to pressure himself, but Sterling was going to walk him to the fence through hell or high water. We could see that with just how he came out. So where normally we kind of expected, I think, before the fight that Sandhagen would be playing the role that he played against Rafael Samsa, where he'd be pressuring from range and Sterling would be trying to play the back foot. But instead, Sterling flipped the script. He came out hot, pushed Sandhagen back, and the rest was history. So that's the thing about Aljamain Sterling striking. I think his defense is a lot weaker than Petr. I guess we're flowing into the matchup here since that's where we're headed. I think his defense is a lot weaker than Petr Yan's. We saw against Pedro Munoz, a lot of it was just ducking out of exchanges, and he took the front kick to the body regularly. I think that's why I wouldn't really favor him against Pedro Munoz over 5, which isn't a big indictment because Pedro Munoz, just from a physical standpoint, is just monstrous to deal with over 5 rounds. I don't think Frankie Edgar beat him over 5 rounds. Rivera probably would have finished over 5 rounds. So it's not really a huge deal, but it looked like a fight where his defensive liabilities below the head, which are tougher to deal with when you're craftier than you are deep, would have sunk him. So where this fight goes kind of depends on Aljamain's strategic acumen, I think, because if Petr Yan gets going, I think Yan's pressure footwork is significantly better than Aljamain Sterling's outside footwork. Sterling, again, he's good at direction changes. He can walk guys onto counters, but Pedro Munoz did have a lot of success playing a pressure game in a broad sense, where guys have had a lot less success outfighting Petr Yan, especially as the fight goes on. Where Aljamain Sterling has a real opportunity is with Yan's slow start. Yan takes a second to read his opponent. It's not really like a Chito Vera style slow start where he looks bad for the first round. It's just he takes a little while to get his reads, and even against Aldo, he nearly finished him in the first round. So it's really tough to say that he's just not a factor. But he's a lot more likely to concede the ring craft if Aljo comes out hot early, like first, second early, runs out, threatens the wrestling and pushes him to the fence. So that's a route for Aljamain Sterling, especially considering, as we mentioned, Yan's tendency to it is the point to do it, but to turtle up and get up, which is something that Dan Tom mentioned. We've seen that Yan is pretty scrambly, and Aljamain Sterling can just get his hooks in and lock the position down consistently. It's like Yan isn't Corey Sandhagen in terms of how he approaches takedown defense. Sandhagen's a lot looser and confident in scrambling, but we have seen Sandhagen deal with a good top player in Rafael Assunção, and Aljamain Sterling just kind of shut him down in a way Assunção couldn't. Okay. But okay, you guys can't see the chat, so this is wild. But in terms of how it goes when it goes deeper, I think Petr Yan has a real shot at troubling him in the clinch. I'm not that hard to break in this. But I think Yan's, as I mentioned, is wrist control, because Ed mentioned Aljamain Sterling's shot in the open isn't fantastic all the time. He, against Corey Sandhagen, was much more of a clinch wrestler. And Petr Yan's wrist control on the inside, his ability to work with collar ties and frames, is, I think, going to deal a significant amount of trouble for Aljamain Sterling getting to body locks. I think the fact that Yan tends to be the better in terms of clinch entries and exits is going to cause Aljamain Sterling some issues, because if he enters with like a collar tie and wrist control, for instance, it's going to be pretty tough for Aljamain Sterling to just shock him with the body lock and drag him down. So I think that initial advantage is going to be pretty tough for Aljamain Sterling to overcome. And then as the fight goes on, I think Yan's going to be able to read his defensive tendencies pretty easily, more easily than against deeper pocket boxers like Jimmy Rivera, because Rivera is he looked fantastic in that fight. He's generally a tough matchup for pressure boxers, where Aljamain Sterling, I think, is a little bit more susceptible to that. So at the risk of encouraging more penis jokes, we can move on to whoever's next.
If it's your first time watching a fight site prediction panel or listening to one, the game within the game is trying to make each other laugh in the Zoom chat while they're speaking. And I don't know, we don't do it all the time, but Sriram broke the format, so he deserved it.
That was the format. It was like you go around and then you do the matchup after. That was the last Aljo person. Yet.
You were the last Aljo person. You were the last Aljo person. That's true.
Why I was enthusiastically egging him on to go.
Anyway, you're right. You were the last Aljo person. So anyway, the matchup. Let's talk about it. Except for I'm here. Already went. It's hard to. What I do pretty much every fight, like every big fight where there's like someone I care about, is I talk myself into why they're gonna win. I did it with Dustin Poirier. I'm doing it with Yan right now. I do it all the time. So caveat that I'm biased and I'm purposefully seeking out why Yan is going to win and going along with that. Not that I don't like Aljo, I do. But also Ben's been going really hard for him, so that makes me want him to lose now because I hate Ben. So anyway, so the matchup. Whenever I think about striker versus pressure grappler, we talked about this on multiple podcasts at this point. I think about ring craft. What positions are they going to be in the cage? And despite Aljo's best grappling performances, in my opinion, his best wrestling performances, in my opinion, coming off of when he was actually a more deliberate pressure fighter, he typically doesn't push the issue. So if the other fighter says, I'm going to be the one that pressures in this matchup, typically he's okay with that. He's been the outfighter much more often than he's been the pressure fighter in most of his fights. So against the most defined pressure fighter, besides maybe Munoz he's ever fought, I think he's going to end up on the back foot. And that really changes a lot here because, maybe he intercepts and they end up in the clinch and he puts them on the cage and they end up in those favorable grappling positions. Although even then, not as good of a shot at taking someone down or getting to their back than if you actually got in on the shot in transition. So it's still not the same, but I already think that hurts Aljo's chances to not get him in those good positions, especially where we can, use your size to your advantage. I think that size is going to be less and less of a factor as time goes on in the matchup, as, the cardio tables start to turn Not that Aljo is going to gas necessarily, but any degree of fatigue is going to make a big difference against Petr Yan. So the ring craft, I think, is a really important note right away. That Aljo is probably going to be put on the back foot, and he is pretty comfortable getting off on most of his offense, not taking the lead. Like the Munoz fight is probably the best example of, Sterling is throwing freaking everything while being pressured really hard. On the other hand, Yan isn't Pedro Munoz. And that's going to go both ways in this discussion of why Aljo, it might be good or bad for Yan, is the differences between him and Munoz. But he's not Munoz in the sense that his head doesn't stay in the same place and he doesn't just throw slow hooks in the same spot all the time. Although I will say in his last fight against Jimmy Rivera, he started to actually look a little smarter with his defense. It's a little more built-in defense. He had like a pull check hook type of deal going on. So that's a tangent. But yeah, Jan's defense is decent, pretty good. And he's got a little bit of a counterpunching game, and his transitional offense is very good, like we said. So, if Sterling's throwing a lot, I do trust Jan to either smother him and start to get to the bicep ties and, strike off the brakes and start to control the exchanges a little bit more. I don't think he's going to get overwhelmed with volume. I think actually volume is better for him as a counterpuncher, as someone who's looking for openings. I keep going back to these Magomedov fights. I know they were a long time ago, and I know a lot can change, but it's weird. He's had matchups that don't totally show off his style and his ability in the UFC. Part of that being that they've been 3-rounders. But yeah, in the Magomedov fights, something that Magomedov did really well was just interrupting whatever Jan was about to start doing with just like single straights. Just whenever he was walking in, just trying to tag him with those straights and disengaging and starting over the situation, and not trying to throw combinations with them and not trying to have these long drawn out exchanges. And when Jan was actually able to get him planted and not, allow him to escape and reset those situations, that's where things got hairy. And I definitely rate Sterling more as a defensive fighter, and I really definitely rate Sterling more in terms of ring craft. I think I rate Sterling more everywhere, and he's bigger and he's more athletic. But just looking at how Jan deals with those situations, what troubles him. Similar thing with the Aldo fight. A lot of it was Jan walking in, Aldo hitting a nice counter, like pulling him into the knees, and then pushing off, hitting the angle, and ending that situation. So I think extended exchanges typically favor Petr Yan, which is interesting. So is Aljo going to do the thing he typically does as a striker? Is he going to change his game plan and fight a lot differently than he has in the past based on the matchup? Same question for Yan. Is Jan's strike selection going to be any different? Is he going to take as many risks with regard to his offense? Something people point out a lot, which I think is fair to point out, is the overextension on his rear hand. Sometimes he'll step through it. He'll like break a stance, or he'll like fall off too hard, and he'll actually give up a pretty big angle right here, which is, I think, something Ben's probably going to talk about, is, when he overshoots like that, and he, gives up a deep underhook or something close to the clinch, and, he has to really quick swim in his own underhook and, make sure he doesn't give up the back. But that's kind of the thing, though, is despite Jan giving up positions sometimes and putting himself in less than ideal situations, he's just flat good in the clinch, flat good in a scramble, flat good as a wrestler, knows how to defend singles, knows how to scramble out of doubles, knows how to do everything. So it's not as big a deal for him in many ways to end up there. As Ben's saying, though, Aljo is a really bad person to give up a good grappling position to. So I'm totally seeing the possibility that with the way Jan is striking, he does get taken down. He does give up a bad position. But I also see that Jan's, very competent grappler, very scrappy, knows how to fight wrists, knows how to fight grips. And I don't see it being a situation like the Sandhagen fight where he's getting subbed early. So I think Sterling is going to have a consistent game plan where he's able to, impose whatever he's going to be doing for 5 rounds. And that's a really, really tall order. So I think that's already something against him. I think this matchup is kind of uphill for Aljo. Not that he can't do it. It's just there's a lot working against him. Some habits that I don't like, especially worse when you're being pressured and you're trying to do these things off the back foot. Like the double to diffuse pressure like he could do against Munoz. Not saying that's how he's going to be trying to take him down, but just based on Jan's volume and as things pick up, I think he will be level changing a lot more. And it's not great mechanically. It's a lot of bending over at the waist and reaching. And that's a pretty bad thing to do against someone who's so good with timing their knees up the middle or uppercuts up the middle or framing off and opening you up for transitional offense off of that. So I have a hard time seeing him not getting pieced up a bit in those situations. I think he's actually pretty durable despite the knockout loss in the past. Getting shinned in the dome by Marlon Moraes in round 1 is a lot different than getting hit by Petr Yan. I think there's a huge power and speed differential there. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really, really ugly fight regardless. There's definitely the possibility that Aljo puts himself in a bad position, early on and gets knocked out. There's also the possibility that Yan gives up a bad position early and gets submitted or put in a really bad spot. But, over 5 rounds, who does the fight favor? Favors Yan. Who's going to have a harder time getting to the place they want the fight to be? Probably Aljo. So I think those things just work against him. So it's not like I think Jan's just better. I just think the way the matchup works is going to be pretty good for Yan. And I think that cage size, something Dan Tom always talks about, is also something to consider here. This is going to be big cage, right? I think big cage. What? No, small cage.
If it's in Vegas,
Small
it's the
cage,
small
Apex.
cage.
Small cage. All right.
Yeah.
Well, that could be something that works in Aljo's favor. It could also be something that works against him because he's being pressured and put on the cage. So I can definitely see both paths to victory here. I'm just thinking in my head, what's more likely? Who's more likely to survive the other's good situations? I think it's Yan. And something that isn't really a good thing to do in making picks is letting other people influence you. But I'm letting other people influence me. A lot of people people that I like and respect are also picking Yan, and I'm just going to trust what they're seeing and go ahead with that pick as well.
All right. So first off, there's a lot of obviously great analysis that was.
Thank you so much.
Made, not by you. First off, I'm writing an article specifically about the clinch, so keep an eye out for that. That's pretty much ready to go. It's whenever it's edited with it's ready to go, I think. So please keep an eye out for that. I really think it's a great piece. Specifically of this matchup, and it kind of comes down to how Petr Yan approaches this fight is going to be a big part of how this fight goes. If Petr Yan, as I mentioned, he's more willing to kind of allow his opponent to kind of dictate where the fight takes place somewhat, or at least in sections. If he allows Aljo to come forward, I think that's a really bad tactical mistake strategic mistake, not tactical, strategic error to make. We've seen Aljo being allowed to come forward. He actually is in a much better spot when he does that because he's able to get his kicks and punches off in a way that keep him safer because he's at the distance that he wants to. He's all the way out and he's able to move forward, so he's in charge of that range. He's going to force Yan back to the cage where he does not want to be. That's the first thing I want to make clear. So I do think that and I think Jan's aware of that. I think he knows he's going to have a much better time pressuring. I think he's going to probably have paid a lot of attention to that Munoz fight and try and take as much of it as he can from it. So I think we're going to see Yan coming forward. So that changes the dynamic of the fight because if Aljo is able to go forward, I really see that the balance tips in his favor heavily for me. So Yan is going to come forward. Then it comes down to how Yan approaches the actual engagements, engaging in these exchanges. Is he going to kick? Because he's gotten his kick caught before multiple times. He leaves them out there a little bit too long sometimes. If he takes away his own kicks, he's conceding an entire range to a rangier fighter who likes to kick a lot. That's number one. Second question for Yan. Is he aware of just how often he puts himself into these dangerous scramble situations with his punching mechanics? So is he gonna kind of like, and it's intentional in a lot of ways because again, he's reaching for those collar ties so that he can get into the clinch. So he could put himself in those positions to get takedowns of his own because he actually has a really good sneaky takedown game. For example, in the Jimmy Rivera fight, when he actually missed on a hook, he actually tried to wrap his leg around Jimmy on the right side and fall into a kind of like an outside trip double leg takedown The problem is that Jimmy is a walking fucking tank, and you can't actually move him. So that didn't work. Also, he kind of pivoted out and he was ready to go into the clinch, but that's, so is he going to take those things away from his game and kind of pare it down so that he kind of be just striking with Aljo? Because I think if he does make those decisions, he's going to have a really hard time with finding Aljo, because even though his footwork is much better, it's pressure footwork, and he's obviously a much more technically proficient and deep striker, when you're kind of paring away a lot of the things that make you successful as a striker, it can give you some hesitancy. It gives your opponent a lot more leeway to do the things they want to do. So I'm very curious how Jan's going to approach this. That's the first thing. If we just see how Jan usually approaches fights, he's not going to change things up. He's going to do he's going to do the things that brought him to the dance. He's going to do the things that won him the title. That's when I think those individual exchanges are really, really going to be interesting. If Jan's coming forward, he's doing the things, he's going to be throwing those same kind of strikes which get him into trouble, or at least open up his back to be taken. That's what I want to see. I want to see if Aljo can take advantage of those situations. I do think he can, and I think that's what's going to make it interesting. With regard to Corey Sandhagen specifically, I think that a big problem I have is that people underrate his grappling. This dude completely shut down Rafael Sunsao with seemingly with ease in their few grappling exchanges that they did have. He completely shut him down, and it was very technical, and it was very, very good positional awareness on his part, and awareness of when he was in danger. Aljo is he's just that fucking good. That's how impressive it was, because Sandhagen, my biggest issue coming into that fight was like, man, I'm really not sure if Aljo's going to be able to. I was like, okay, he might get to those positions, but can he submit Corey, and can he go? No, he just easily took him out, and that's so impressive because of how good Sandhagen is. So even though Jan is a proficient grappler, I'm not sure he's that much better than Sandhagen as a grappler. He has different issues in terms of how he approaches grappling than Sandhagen does, but I don't think he's that much better than Sandhagen. So Jan's gonna probably, unless Jan can just completely strand Aljo into a mid-range boxing match, I do think we're gonna see those positions happen. I do think that Aljo's gonna find those openings to either get to the back or shoot a reactive double leg, because again, Jan puts himself in those bad spots pretty often, I think, for how his striking style is built, for how his game is built. If he's not, and again, he'll also engage in takedown attempts and clinch, because again, it's built into his striking. It's built into how he approaches fights. Even when it behooves him to just continue striking, he will consistently put himself into those grappling or clinch situations. It's hard for me to make a call, because I really do see this as a coin flip fight. If Aljo can get those positions consistently, take the back, and work on choke attempts and control, it's a really interesting fight. I am curious about the pace, because Jan is one of the best pace fighters in the sport, and Aljo, we've seen him slow down earlier in his career. I do think that people feel that he would probably have lost maybe the 4th or 5th round against Munoz had that fight continued, and it's an understandable feeling. He was taking a lot of attritive damage. I don't think it was him gassing. I think he just was getting, his legs were beat up, So I can absolutely see this going multiple ways. Jan by just a flash KO wouldn't shock anybody, I think. It would be a little surprising, but it wouldn't shock me. Jan just beating him down over time and getting out of some bad spots, totally reasonable take. Aljo being able to control him pretty cleanly, I don't think people would be too surprised. Again, he is that fucking good. I think people would be shocked if it happened a little bit, kind of like they were shocked how Gaethje was really not very good at grappling when Khabib took him down. They were surprised. So I think people are overlooking Aljo, because, like I said, when you see someone grow up in the UFC, you kind of never let go of their flaws. So I'm really, really looking forward to this fight. I'm gonna pick Aljo because of how hard I'm the only person going on this on the site. The only other person with me is Tommy, and if that's my backup, I actually feel pretty secure, because remember when I said I would look through the win percentage of people calling fights? Yeah, Tommy was number 1. Sriram, I have your win percentage if you still want it. But yeah, Aljo, I'm going to go with Aljo via submission, late round 1, early round 2. Just he gets those positions and he doesn't let Jan go. Jan tries to scramble out of it because he gets a little bit panicky and gets caught with the rear naked.
Late round 1, early round 2 is super key. You make me feel better that Tommy's on your side, Ben, because I like Tommy. He's smart, and I too, like you guys, believe and practice in the make-believe martial art, which makes sense because, like, if I, got 2 black belts in make-believe martial arts, and the third one I'm going for is jiu-jitsu, so it just makes sense. I got to keep it consistent, right? Only the woo-woo martial arts that don't work, because we all know grappling is dead. That being said, kind of like how we started this discussion off, or Ben did with that note, I still will fall down the same trail as Ben here, actually. I liked Aljo kind of from the onset, and I'm not alone because that plus money kind of shrank that he opened up as, and I totally get him being a slight dog to Petr Yan. I'm not somebody poking as many holes in Petr Yan's resume. However, stylistic matchups do matter, and in the panel we did for the 4 lightweights, it ended up being a big discussion on one of the big takeaways is that pressure grapplers can be a hard matchup to deal with. Obviously, the more pronounced pressure fighter is Jan, although the more pronounced grappler, obviously, Sterling. So it's not apples for oranges here. Don't take me too literally. However, I do believe that what our come away from that panel or that theory, the common crossover is that regardless of where you stand on that spectrum, is that somebody trying to push a grappling game on you. I find it harder to pick against them when that match is taking place in the small cage. That's why I picked Aljo against Sandhagen. That happened in the Apex. That's why I'm going to pick Aljo against Jan. Also, because even though they are different, they do both turtle and tripod. Jan, much more technically sound, much more layers to his scrambles. He'll swim his arms as well. He's really smart in how he does that as far as shucking hooks and getting underhooks and getting around. Really good stuff. If he's able to survive and or get those things off, he also provides little pockets where I could actually see him hurting him, Aljamain Sterling in close, going in and out of the clinch more than if he's even able to get a range game for sustained periods against Sterling. I like late round 1, early round 2s, because I believe that if Jan does survive with those tactics and whether or not he's able to hurt Aljo with those tactics, he can pull away with a better gas tank and his attritional work with legs in the body. That's where you got to hit Aljo. It's really hard to find Aljo's head. However, kicks, it's funny. One of you guys noted that Jan is slow to retract his kicks. Again, I'm not going to go too hard on the striking. I'm still got to catch up and rewatch Jan's UFC fights, at least select ones. But right now I'm on Jan Magomedov 2. And the interesting thing is I'm going to look at that straight shot note that Ed mentioned, is because in my boxing notes, as far as Aljamain's boxing improvements, one of his biggest boxing improvements is he smartly added a check jab. I don't know if that's the official word for it, but it's something that more fighters need to do. It's the same kind of, it's not so much of a bring you back on balance like a check hook, but hence the word check. It provides a safety check coming out of exchanges. So it never hurts to, hence why you hear, educated striker, stereotypical commentary, right? He finishes his combinations with his lead hand. Usually it's the left, because usually it's an orthodox fighter. So I really like that. And if that note is true, what Ed said, that is something to watch out for. But ultimately, I think the saving grace will be countering kicks, because I just watched a couple times, because I kept getting interrupted, the first round of Magomedov Jan 2. And it looks like Jan doesn't want to throw kicks because he got countered so many times. Like in the first fight, he came out, he's like, okay, I'm going to try my best to stick with boxing. And of course, as soon as he throws a kick, you could tell what he did. And it looked like he really tried to as soon as it hit the body, you see Jan really try to retract it and stamp his foot back down on the ground. And of course, Magomedov follows it down for a single, and he's able to get a wrestling exchange off of it. I think he eventually clubs him and gets him down. But the point was, it looked like Jan was, and I know that fight, the rematch is a while ago now, but it looked like Jan was specifically trying not to give the guy a catch, counter, kick, counter, and he still gave it to him. So those things kind of trouble me if I go on and watch tape and see that Jan is still doing that. So for that reason, I am gonna probably pick officially. Reserve my right to change, but I'm probably honestly gonna pick Aljamain Sterling to get it done within the first 2 rounds. Again, with the caveat, if he doesn't, Jan's probably going to pull away with body work and leg work down the stretch because he has a better gas tank. Aljo cuts, a ton of weight. But also, I'm going to be a little bit biased too because Aljo's not going to have Longo in his corner. Maybe Sarah or not Sarah, one of those two. But he's actually going to have Eric Nixick, my guy from Extreme Couture, who's been doing really well. All my bias aside, the guy's a really good cornerman, so I like that for Aljo as well.
Nice. Yeah, Ben's really happy that you're also picking Aljo, so he's not the only one. But on the other hand, it's like he doesn't get to share the glory if it does work out as much now that other people are picking him. So, really, it's a bad thing.
It's worth it. It's honestly worth it. Also, the entire fight site's picking against me. So
yeah, that's true. I like being split on our picks. I think that's always helpful. We always get a lot of flack when we're like close to being unified on something. And it's like we decided these things independently. Dan, it just doesn't mean anything.
I do want to raise if I'm right.
Sure. We talked about Dan Tom just talked about the nutritional body and leg work. Not ruling out the possibility that Jan hits him with a calf kick that just like ruins his leg really early on because those things are unpredictable and sometimes things go bad in those situations. But yeah, we're gonna pivot quickly to Israel Adesanya versus Jan Blachowicz for the light heavyweight title, and we're actually gonna start with Dan Tom because he's on the schedule. So what do you got to say, Dan?
I was going to bow out of this one, but there was one note that I wanted to mention. Maybe it'll kick you guys off, and I actually do have to bow out anyway. So, hey, what do you know? I don't want to steal the hosting thunder or the setup thunder. I'll just add some quick notes. Obviously, I don't disagree with Izzy, the favorite. It's probably going to be hard for me to pick against him, even though I'll be rooting for Jan because that's just what I do. I will say this, though. I know that I'm sure you guys will talk about all the deficiencies and pros and cons. I will just say some things to look out for. Is that Jan has a really good left hook and a lead kick. He would make it really obvious and switch to southpaw, and you just knew the body kick was coming, as was that MMA meta. That's why everyone was bedazzled by Dillashaw or Cruz before him, is because everybody would just switch to southpaw and throw a body kick. But Jan actually is really good off his lead side, and when I interviewed him, I asked him that specifically, and he said he feels much stronger off of that side. You could even argue that he perhaps is one of those rare, like I'm a right-handed southpaw. I feel like it's super rare to have left-handed orthodox, but maybe not because most gyms will force you to fight that way. And I only bring that up is because whether it's kickboxing or MMA, a lot of the best things that have landed on Israel Adesanya have been that side. Obviously, the left hook from Alex Pereira, the head kick, which was like the same style head kick that Robert Whittaker did but couldn't do against him. But sure enough, Kelvin Gastelum hits Adesanya with it, right? That was from the left side. Now, common threads with both of those was that Israel was in a southpaw stance when all those happened, which caused me to suspect in a lot of my breakdowns on Israel is that if somebody chooses to blitz him when he's in a southpaw stance, that's how you can get him. Because his defense, there's a big difference there. However, as soon as I say that, like I was preaching that before the Whittaker fight, and in that Whittaker fight, and since then, you see him when he takes the southpaw stance, just kind of shifting harder offline and staying away from anything coming back at him, and doing it in a much smarter way than like Luke Rockhold, where Luke Rockhold would just kind of move his trunk offline. And then he would bring his head right back into the same punching zone, which is how that left hook from Michael Bisping lit him the F up. And obviously, if my dumbass can distract that or deconstruct that, obviously Jan can, because Jan knew exactly what to throw on Luke Rockhold as far as, a guy's susceptible to the side I throw strongest from. And he was going for that and rocked Rockhold multiple times. Another tall guy. Again, obviously, the craft is Adesanya not comparable, not just in that one move, but overall, obviously not apples for apples. But I just did want to, before I leave, kick you guys off with that food for thought. Not saying it should change your thoughts or picks or sway you toward the underdog here, but I just wanted to leave a pathway for the Polish power guys.
I appreciate it. Are you hanging out or you're actually leaving?
Yeah, I do got to actually bounce
All
it.
right.
That's cool. That's be abrupt and
thank you so much for joining us, and we love you.
Like the video and subscribe. Hey, like the video and subscribe, guys. I know I'm not the fight side guy, but I'm gonna do the corporate work for you guys. Seriously, like this video, subscribe to their channel, guys.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of the show.
Have a good night, Dan.
See you later. All right, cool. So those were very good notes that I think we needed, because I don't have a lot to say about this. In fact, I mean, let's this is very professional. Let's call it right now. We just want to do briefly talk about both guys and do matchup per turn and not do separate turns for both guys.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I don't think there's a ton to say
Yeah, I
about.
don't. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll go first.
Yeah, I would say some. Yeah,
because I had nothing to say. So Israel Adesanya, obviously one of the best strikers in the UFC, if not the best right now. A lot of strengths, good strike selection. His use of feints and both hip and shoulder and his specific strikes and level changing and his ability to counter off the back foot and his kicking game and his ring craft and his clinch game. He's got a lot going for him. He's also fairly durable. Great cardio, very fit, stronger than he looks as well, and super confident. So we've seen him win in a variety of ways, not like different types of finishes necessarily, but just different kinds of fights that he's won. We've also seen him in some weird fights where he might have looked more vulnerable than people expected. The one that people harped on for a while was the Kelvin Gastelum fight, where he had a couple of moments where he didn't do so well, and Kelvin had a lot more success than you think he would have, just given that it was a striking-based matchup. But then you had a matchup that, based on that one against Robert Whittaker, you're like, okay, well, Kelvin Gastelum had a lot of success leading against Izzy, so Robert Whittaker, who's much better in the lead and more explosive and more diverse and yada yada, he should do well, right? But I think maybe something about the extension of the exchanges and not really having as much of a threat of the wrestling and just the way that Whittaker approached it, and maybe the less of a level of faking dynamic made it really so Izzy didn't have to worry about the same things and could focus more on his back foot counters, which is what he was trying to do when Kelvin gave him that trouble. So I think there are some factors there that aren't being considered. And let's be honest, the trouble that Kelvin gave him ended up being pretty minimal, and that fight quickly descended into an ass kicking, and arguably Kelvin was finished by the end of it. So it's maybe a bit overblown. Then you have the Yoel Romero fight, which I'm never going to watch it again. Let's be honest. If you want like a really high level dissection of that fight, a very brave man by the name of Dan Albert actually broke it down and turned it into this whole thing about like why is Yoel Romero? Why does he do this? And how does he do this? And how does he keep getting away with it? So that's a very good article. But that fight kind of showed you what happens when there's a counter threat, there's a wrestling threat, there's like a power threat, and the person doesn't really react to your feints so much. So it's harder for you to set up reliably the shots that you want to throw. That's kind of the point, right? You feint and they react a certain way. You're like, okay, now my jab's there. Like, oh, okay, I can do these things to create the opening to start my combinations the way I want to. And a few times when he did lead, he did get countered pretty early on and big, pretty big counters. So that kind of scared him off. And Yoel Romero tricked him into not fighting for about 3 rounds, which worked out very well in his favor. Now, Jan Blachowicz is someone who could replicate the not fighting for 3 rounds part. We've seen him in some pretty terrible fights before, but he's someone that I think feels more pressure to lead, feels more pressure to commit to striking and throw. But he's fairly competent. He has a kicking game, which is something that, like Ryan Wagner has pointed out, that might be kind of a weakness in the armor of the city kickboxing guys, is maybe the way that they're like, settling into their stances to try to set things up and do their work, and the way they retreat on the back foot. It kind of opens them up to kicking it, and maybe round kicking is something that could be a problem for them. I think it has to be off of offense. I don't think Jan Blachowicz is going to be able to just naked kick Izzy. I think he's going to have to create some sort of threat with his hands to open up his defensive reactions and exploit that with his kicks. And Jan's hands, while he has these big counter punches that he's landed, those are counter punches, and they've come off of like the clinch breaks, and they've come off of people leading pretty poorly on him and like running in with their hips and like really exposing themselves and just things that Israel Adesanya doesn't do. So when you look at the successes that Jan has had, I'm not necessarily sure that those same openings are there. So I think it would require Jan to come into this fight looking a lot different than he has in the past, or at least using his tools in a different way. I mean, he can jab. His defense is pretty good in a static sense. Like he can, if you're just trying to kick him naked, he can deal with that pretty well. You saw that in the Rockhold fight. You saw him in the Reyes fight. He can be pretty stingy, which is helpful. But you also saw like he's not the most disciplined fighter, and things can get pretty hairy sometimes and pretty messy. And the Thiago Santos fight is a pretty big indictment of the way he'll break sometimes. And those habits weren't gone in the Reyes fights. He did pretty similar stuff that he did in the Santos fight in the Reyes fight. So I don't think he's changing a ton. With regard to like the grappling and wrestling threat, if they did end up in grappling situations, I think that Jan could do pretty well, but he's not really the type to enforce a wrestling game plan on someone. He's not really a leg attacker. And as I said earlier, Izzy's very good in the clinch. So I have a hard time finding paths to victory for Jan. And I think it requires a bit of imagination to come up with his game plan. And that's too far of a reach to really make a pick based on that. So I'm going to pick Israel Adesanya to open up as the fight goes on and win a fairly wide decision. But I think it could be a little bit ugly and tight early on just because of Jan's stinginess, and maybe he'll be more hesitant, and maybe there'll be a little bit of competition with the kicking game. But I think things will open up for Izzy after the second round, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything you said about Izzy. I mean, there's really not a ton to say, surprisingly, just because he's so diverse and does different things in like most of the exchanges. So he's very good at a lot of things. Jan Blachowicz is more flawed, so it's kind of more interesting to talk about in a sense, just because you can be like, oh, he doesn't do this thing well, which means that there are these openings where Adesanya is just feints super well, creates openings really, really well. He's one of the better kickers in the sport. We saw that against Paulo Costa, partly. I mean, Costa's kind of tough just because he has no kicking defense, and like Johnny Hendricks kicked him up, but also Adesanya kind of kicked his ass. So that's one thing. Very good positionally. That's one thing that we saw against Robert Whittaker, who blitzed in, and Adesanya compromised his positioning instantly by breaking the line of attack. And I think that's one way that Jan Blachowicz is really going to struggle, because Blachowicz has a jab, he has a counter left hook, and past that, everything that he throws, if he tries to throw in combination, there are these really big blitzing combinations that got him killed against Thiago Santos. He breaks stance. Against Thiago Santos, he wasn't even breaking stance well. He was dragging one of his feet behind him, it was disgusting to see. It looked like he broke his ankle or like his foot fell asleep. So that's not encouraging, because Adesanya isn't going to do what Santos did, where Santos is kind of backed up and clobbered him with a big hook, left hook, right hook, something like that. Adesanya is going to step off to the side and crack Jan as he's turning. So that's one way in which I think Adesanya can pretty easily manufacture a finish. For Jan, I mean, punching into kicks has worked against Izzy several times. Gastelum did it. Whittaker actually had a decent head kick in the second round, I believe. And, you mentioned, Ryan mentioned that kicks are a city kickboxing weakness defensively. It's one thing that I'd have liked to see a little bit more from Whittaker, just because of Adesanya's Adesanya's use of that big lean back, where, if guys blitz at him, he does like the Matrix thing that makes everyone super impressed, but isn't actually particularly sound in a lot of instances. And punching into middle kicks is one thing that Jan Blachowicz does relatively consistently. He did it a lot against Dominic Reyes, and that's how he finished Ilir Latifi in his UFC debut, so something that has always been part of his game. So that's one thing that I'd like to see, but I also don't think Jan gets those blitzes for free. In terms of how Adesanya does in the lead, I think he gets a pretty easy job of it. Against Jimmy Manuwa, Blachowicz was on a hair trigger on the counter. This is the rematch. No one even remembers the first fight, so the rematch. He was really, really keyed in on that counter left hook and tried to flow into combinations off that, but also he bit on it really, really hard. So that's one thing that I think Adesanya can take advantage of, just drawing that out with his feints, hitting the body, kicking the legs. Blachowicz isn't like super easy to kick, but also he hasn't faced a super crafty kicker. Mostly guys just try to blast through the open side the way Luke Rockhold and Dominic Reyes do. So it's a tough fight. It's a really tough fight for Jan Blachowicz. Like, maybe the size advantage and his kicking game come together to like make it a little bit uncomfortable for Adesanya. But if Adesanya does the things that we've seen him do before, I don't think it's particularly difficult.
Yeah, so I think something that needs to be kind of talked about also is that Izzy for middleweight is a pretty plus athlete. He's obviously not a Yoel Romero, but he's a damn fine athlete. And he's extremely fast. He's rather strong. His proprioception and his reaction times are insane. And Jan Blachowicz, even for a light heavyweight, is not any of that. In fact, his entire gimmick is that he's a light heavyweight who tries to be good. And the problem is that when you're good for a light heavyweight and you're facing someone who's going to be really goddamn good just as a general statement in MMA, and is also going to have a significant athletic advantage over you, won't be at a tremendous size disadvantage in terms of height, length, and reach. Jan will probably have the strength advantage, but I also don't really see him being able to utilize it too well. Unfortunately, he's just doesn't really have the best wrestling entries. He's actually pretty solid in the clinch. He has some really good punches off the break, which we saw him murder former middleweight champion Luke Rockhold with. And he's, I think he's rather intelligent as a fighter. He does tend to come in with decent ideas of what he needs to do. But the problem is he's also still a light heavyweight, right? Like he's still fighting guys who are not necessarily going to be able to challenge him in ways that are going to put him in bad spots that he would have to work out of. And the middleweights that he's fought coming up, like he's kind of like the old middleweight killer, right? Jacare and Luke Rockhold and stuff like that. People are gonna be like, well, he fought middleweights and those middleweights were good middleweights, so you can't say that he doesn't know what he's doing. Like, obviously, but again, when you're fighting guys who are in the tail ends of their career and they're just physically shot, it's not really going to tell us all that much. You have Luke Rockhold, who was trying to wrestle for the first time in his life, apparently, and all that time at AKA, he never learned how to wrestle, apparently. So. And we actually did see him regress. He used to actually be a bit more of an adept clinch fighter, but whatever. That's not the point. Clinch wrestler, but that's not the point here. Jan likes to kind of just do these long range outfighting techniques where he's going to be, using a pretty decent jab. Like you said, he has that pretty solid kicking game, and it's very effective. He's quite good at utilizing those techniques. However, when you're in a fight with Thiago Santos not that long ago. It's not like it's 5-6 years ago. It was only like 2-3 years ago that he was getting outfought from the outside by Thiago Santos and got so frustrated that he decided to do a blitzing, shifting combination that had him deaded on impact. It's not a good look, and he could still be kind of brought out of position with feints, and when he feels a bit more frustrated, he could still kind of do those marching forward, shifting combinations that got him in trouble over there. I don't think the grappling will come into play too much, and even if it does, Izzy, when he has been in those situations, shows that while he's obviously not an elite grappler, he knows to do the right things to get himself free of those situations. He does a really good job of fighting for grips, digging for underhooks. He constantly is framing against. To create space and get back up, whether against the cage or an open space. If he needed to be, he would I imagine, do the same thing. So I'm really not seeing how much Jan can do here. He's durable, but he's been rocked. He's been knocked out. He's not unhurtable, and Izzy's going to have such a tremendous speed advantage that I really am not sure if Jan's going to be able to play that super patient game unless he's just content with not getting knocked out. We saw him with Jacare. He's content to just do fucking nothing for 25 minutes. But I don't know if he's going to be able to play that game with Izzy, because I feel like he's going to be feinted into doing something bad or dumb or put himself out of position. And Izzy's really good at building on his reads. We know that. So I actually think that Izzy's going to knock him out probably like maybe third round, fourth round. It might be earlier, but I wouldn't bank on it. Jan is tough. He is patient for the most part. He might just sit on the outside and just try and wait it out, but eventually he's going to come in, and Izzy's going to draw him in and just kill him on these counters, I think. If he can't knock him out, I think it'll be just a wide decision. Not expecting it to be an especially exciting fight either. So, yeah, Izzy by third or fourth round KO.
So we're unanimous on the Izzy pick, which means that Jan's going to win, which is
I'd be
interesting.
thrilled. That'd be great.
Yeah, interesting.
I really want that to happen. I want Izzy to win because this sport needs to make sense in some fashion. It has to. Something has to make sense in this fucking dumb sport. But also, fuck, it would be funny if Izzy just gets wrecked on the feet.
And with the swear words, all podcasts. You know, it's a family show. Not really, but anyway.
Kids are asleep, so
those are the men's
Have to let
title
everyone out
fights.
now.
We're not going to do any breakdowns on anything else. Let me get some rapid fire opinions. Nunes Anderson. Who you got? No explanation, just names.
Okay, fine. Nunes, fine.
Sadly, Nunez. I love you, Megan.
Makhachev, Dober.
I feel really bad, but I kind of have to pick Islam here.
Screw it, Dober.
Nice. Santos, Rakic.
Santos beat Anthony Smith better in a cooler fight, and that's like all I really care about. So Santos via silliness, I guess.
Rakic.
Cruz, Kenny. That's a good one.
Yeah, I like that one. That one's actually kind of worth talking about. I like a lot of what Kenny does on the feet against Cruz, the kicking game and the counterpunching, the pretty committed pressure that he did against Haile Alateng. But I think the takedowns are going to be a problem, and the cardio is probably going to be a problem, and Cruz didn't look compromised, as compromised against Cejudo as I thought. Cejudo just fought a really good fight. So I'm going to go with Cruz very tentatively based on, it could just be completely fucked at this point, physically.
Cruz, fuck you, Casey Kenny.
Wow. Seems like this is kind of personal. Yeah, I'm gonna
Don't
go
talk
with,
shit about Megan. That was bullshit. You're a piece of shit.
I'm gonna go with Cruz for the same reason as Sriram with regard to the wrestling matchup. Just because Kenny did get taken down a decent amount of times by Marab and Ray Borg, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say that's a factor.
I thought he won the Marab fight anyway, but Cruz is better on top.
Yeah, in terms of the actual fight itself, like you can't have shit takedown defense against someone like Dominic Cruz.
I don't know
you literally
that
can't
I'll go that far, but yeah, it's
not
he
good.
did beat both of the guys who took him down a lot, so that's.
But for a 135er, but for 135er, you can't have takedown defense like that. It's just not. You're not going to be able to continue to win at the elite level.
He's a scrambly flyweight at 135, basically. I mean, I like it. It's fun.
Yeah, he's a cool fighter. Joe Benavidez versus Escore Eskrov.
I mean, I want Joe to win, definitely, because I like Joe a lot, and also I want Davey Fig to look good. And this win probably makes the second Joe-Davey Fig fight look less predatory and awful. I'm going to go with Joe, because I think Joe's a pretty bad matchup for a top control grappler. Even if he's declined, he was definitely declined against Fig in the second fight, but he still scrambled out of an inch away from putting him out. So let's go.
This is a match Joe would win in his prime, or even slightly post prime, but I can't. His durability is not there anymore compared to what it used to be. He's clearly lost the step in terms of his athletic ability. Askarov is tough, excellent grappling, solid wrestling, nothing amazing, but he should be able to drag it to the ground. And also he's decently heavy-handed. He really badly hurt Tim Elliott multiple times. Even declined Tim Elliott, still tough as nails, and he was hurting him. So I'm going to go with Askarov.
I'm going to go Joe B just because I'm not convinced of his shotness yet. I think I need to see him be shot one more time just to be fully convinced of it. So I'm just going to consider
Fig's the best ever, so it's tough to say.
Yeah. I think, when you're a bit of a husk, it's, way more exacerbated when you're fighting the best athlete in your division. So I just seen a little more evidence of his shotness. I've jumped the gun on someone being shot before, or like
Aldo.
on how shot someone is before. Aldo's still shot. Just jump the gun on how
I don't
shot
know.
they
I'm
are.
saying like I thought he was getting knocked out by Moraes.
Yeah, me too. And I was also
As it
thinking.
turned out, Moraes was also shot.
I was thinking of RDA when I said that, but Aldo's a good example too. But yeah, RDA I thought was like incapable of winning fights anymore. He's actually like not as washed as previously predicted. Also less pronounced at lightweight than welterweight. That's the thing that
Chiesa would look a lot better also in hindsight.
this makes no sense to me that fighters who are clearly declining physically and like stopped cutting weight and like didn't have amazing durability, they go back down in weight, and I'm like, okay, this is clearly a terrible idea. It's going to affect your durability, and you're not going to be even as good as you were at the higher weight class, and then it's fine. Like Cowboy's done it, Frankie Edgar's done it. But to be fair, Frankie Edgar's kind of always been capable of being a bantamweight. But like Aldo cutting to bantamweight, like RDA going back down to lightweight. Like, why does this work? I don't understand it, but that's not the situation we have here. Just on the subject of shotness.
I mean, it's just the guys that we really pay attention to and want to win. They tend to be good enough that they're able to win at that point. And also, like, the opponents. Moraes was pretty much done.
Matchups definitely matter.
Yan fucked him up, so, like, doesn't really count. But also, Felder was on, like, 3 days' notice. So.
Right. All right. So that's a card. I think that card's pretty deep. There are other fights that I find interesting that we didn't even talk about. And listen to the MMA podcast probably on Thursday of this week. And we're going to have a bit of insider intel. Jared McLaughlin's going to come on. He's a fighter training out in New Zealand, and I think he's been to City Kickboxing a few times. He's also trained at Jackson Wink, and we've talked about Josh Fabia before, and he has a really good story about that he said on my podcast, in the early days. But yeah, it should be a good one. And Ben, when's the next grappling podcast, man?
I think we wanted to schedule for sometime this week. So,
do you have a guest coming on?
Not this time. We do have some potential guests not potential guests. We definitely have some guests that we're planning to line up. I'm not going to spoil anything, but we wanted to finish our discussion over on the guard. So we're actually going to be talking about the building which guard is the one you should start with. And I think it's going to be a really great episode. If you haven't checked out the first one, please go check it out. It's about, go check it out. It's honestly was one of the most fun things I've done for this site. So really, really enjoyed it.
Dope. Sounds good. All right. And Dan Tom can be found at Dan Tom MMA on Twitter. And most of his work is on MMAJunkie. But if you follow him on Twitter, you'll see that he's got a lot more going on. And he's just a very busy, hardworking guy. And he's brilliant, and he deserves more and more love. Even though he's got that check mark, you think he'd get more respect on here. But yeah, so check out Dan Tom. And yeah, that's it. Say goodbye.
Bye.
Later, everyone.